When I was a kid, the thing that convinced me to watch Dragon Ball Z was the design of the Super Saiyan. The original manga design was totally fine, but the 90s animated adaptation really drove home the idea that a Super Saiyan is powered up and bursting with energy. So why is it that modern depictions of Super Saiyan feel so flat and impotent by comparison? I mean, sure, low-budget animation is partly to blame, but I think there's something more fundamental missing that made the 90s design so effective. Something that, if applied to modern Dragon Ball, could have made a big difference. Dragon Ball Z established what I refer to as the 3-tier system. Tier 1 is the base form, Tier 2 is a Super Saiyan, and Tier 3 is a Super Saiyan with an aura. Each tier represents an increasingly powerful transformed state. The thing that makes this system so effective is that each tier's design communicates its functional purpose. Tier 1 looks like everything else in the show, and that's by design. The base form is a Saiyan at rest, and an unremarkable color palette conveys that nicely. Tier 3, on the other hand, is a Super Saiyan at their strongest. The aura is a physical manifestation of their overwhelming power, and the color palette takes on a vibrant yellow hue to show that the Saiyan's body is reflecting light from that aura. And since light is coming from all directions, shadows most often reside near the center of whatever object they inhabit. This stands in contrast with normal lighting conditions seen in Tier 1, where shadows are cast opposite of some external light source, usually the sun. There's also an increase in the color palette's contrast. Darkening the shadows increases the relative brightness of the highlights, which tricks your eyes into thinking things actually got brighter overall. Going back to Tier 2, we have the intermediate state where the character is still a Super Saiyan, but doesn't have the aura. The reason I skipped this tier before is because, in the original manga, a Super Saiyan's aura is almost always visible, the only exceptions being when a character has either lowered their power level, or when the artist chooses not to draw it so you can see the action better. But otherwise, the aura is pretty ubiquitous. The anime, on the other hand, made the decision early on to just get rid of the aura entirely from scenes where it was clearly meant to be there according to the source material. And this is totally reasonable, since animating a flame for a full episode would be prohibitively expensive. But taking this shortcut creates a problem. It wouldn't make sense to reuse the color palette from Tier 3, since there's no yellow light coming from the aura. But you still want to convey the idea that a Tier 2 Super Saiyan is powered up and emitting light. The result is a design that sits halfway between the other two tiers. The shadows go back to how they worked in Tier 1, but the colors shift closer to the palette from Tier 3. This subtly conveys to the viewer that Tier 2 is indeed stronger than Tier 1, but does so without burning through your animation budget. The 3-tier system does what any good animated adaptation should. It captures the spirit of the source material and enhances it, giving us something that wouldn't have been possible in print form. Don't get me wrong, Dragon Ball Z certainly had its share of issues, and it took a while for different animators to all get on the same page about how Super Saiyans ought to look. But once they found their footing, the 90s Super Saiyan cemented itself as one of the most iconic designs of all time. In the years following the end of Dragon Ball Z, digital animation took the world by storm, and naturally, the franchise needed a new look to complement the latest technology. But instead of building on the foundation established by Dragon Ball Z, they decided to rebuild the Super Saiyan color palettes from scratch. The new art style they settled on would end up being used in everything from video game cutscenes to an entire new TV show. And while the exact palettes differed slightly between productions, they all followed the same general principles, so I'm going to treat them as the same thing. So what did they gain by taking this new approach? Well, to their credit, the digital coloring is better suited for modern displays, which gives skin tones and dark blues a little more definition. And the designs of this era did generally inherit the shading techniques pioneered by Dragon Ball Z. But that's where my praise ends. This time, the Tier 3 Super Saiyan has lost almost all of its yellow tint and high contrast, with the earliest iterations opting instead for a washed-out, faded look. And while it marginally improved over time, these alterations made the aura feel like a special effect tacked on in post, rather than connected to the character. But that's a minor nitpick in comparison to the most egregious sin they committed, and that's the removal of the second tier. In this version, the Super Saiyans without auras are folded back into Tier 1. This is a shame because it doesn't cost more to have it, you're still painting the same number of frames. But eliminating the second tier means your Super Saiyans don't feel meaningfully different from their base forms. To understand why this matters, I want to look at something Dragon Ball Z did. There was actually a pseudo 4th tier I didn't mention before, and that's the state Goku and Gohan achieve while training for the Cell games. It's sometimes referred to as a Grade 4 Super Saiyan, and it just means they've conditioned their bodies to consume less energy while still transformed. The manga conveys this by giving the characters softer facial expressions, but otherwise it's indistinguishable from their version of a Tier 2 Super Saiyan. The 90s anime takes this a step further. Rather than reusing Tier 2, they decided to paint everything except the hair using the base palette. Goku and Gohan effectively made Super Saiyan function as their base form, so using the base form colors makes it clear they've reduced their power output. It's especially effective because you as the viewer get to experience the same confusion as the characters in the scene about whether or not Goku and Gohan are as strong as they claim. The reason I'm bringing this up is because modern Dragon Ball created this feeling by accident. Removing the second tier implies Super Saiyans without auras aren't any stronger than their base forms, which is especially jarring in scenes where we're meant to believe a character is fighting all out. Even Dragon Ball Super Broly, which is otherwise one of the best looking pieces of Dragon Ball media, exacerbated these problems with its single-tiered design. And while the stellar fight choreography helps mitigate these issues, I still think having distinct color palettes would have given the fight scenes even more impact. But it's not even just the animated works that bother me. As technology has improved, more and more video games have tried to replicate the visuals from the anime. And while many of them do a great job of imitating 2D animation in general, they'll often ignore the 3-tier system entirely. For example, Dragon Ball Z Kakarot, a game that was heavily marketed as being faithful to the 90s anime specifically, opted for a single-tier Super Saiyan color palette that doesn't match the show at all, despite basically every other character looking screen accurate. The irony is that the game has all these modern lighting and particle effects, yet for scenes like this, the aura has no impact on the character's colors or shadows. This is more forgivable in competitive games like Dragon Ball FighterZ, which prioritize gameplay over anime accuracy, but I would still argue that differentiating the, 5 different forms of Goku would have improved readability. There is this one attack that resembles the 90s Tier 3 design, which is great, but it only ever happens in that one brief instance. And it's strange because there are other moves that have an aura, and none of them change the color of the fighter. For whatever reason, games released in the last 10 or so years seem allergic to copying the 3-tier system. And some older games from the PS2 era came pretty close, but they usually combine Tiers 2 and 3 with the color palette staying the same regardless of any aura. One of the only games I could find that implements 3 distinct color palettes for Super Saiyans is Dragon Ball Raging Blast. It's clear the developers had a solid understanding of what each palette represents. They even use the system in cutscenes to mirror the way it's utilized on the show. But while the base palettes stick close to the anime, their Super Saiyans have a low contrast, almost pastel quality that's totally uncharacteristic of Dragon Ball Z. So when Raging Blast 2 was announced, I was hopeful they'd fix the minor visual issues from the first game, since all it would take is tweaking the color and contrast levels. Instead, they pivoted away from cell shading in favor of a completely new airbrushed art style. And it looks fine, it's not a bad looking game. I just wish they would have iterated on the art style they already had when they were so close the first time. It turns out I'm not the only one who felt this way. There was a years-long fan campaign to align the hypothetical Raging Blast 3 more closely to the anime art style. They had comprehensive design documents speculating on how color palettes and auras could be incorporated into gameplay. They even have a full-length proof of concept video, which I highly recommend checking out. But in the end, Raging Blast 3 never materialized, and instead we'd get a never-ending stream of games that all kinda just did their own thing. My complaints might seem ill-informed, considering a lot of the designs I criticized in this video are pretty faithful to some of Akira Toriyama's own artwork. Super Saiyans in the manga weren't colored differently from their base form counterparts, and the shading was all over the place depending on the chapter. But Toriyama even said that he didn't think of his designs much in terms of their exact colors. The occasional colored manga chapters seemed more like a fun extra than a firm declaration of the one true color palette. And more importantly, the role of an animated series is different from that of a manga, and directly copying the manga's art style isn't a guaranteed path to success. So if I were in charge of, say, Dragon Ball Super, what would I have done differently? Well, I think just applying the 3-tier system would be a low-cost way to give each tier a bit more personality. I'm not even saying they should copy the exact colors from Dragon Ball Z. Just crank up the contrast in yellow a bit and you're good to go. Because despite what my clickbait thumbnail implies, I don't want them to resurrect a decades-old TV show. Our collective artistic sensibilities have changed, and my hope is that one day, a new entry will take all the best ideas from across the franchise and combine them to make something truly memorable. Wait, they're still making more?